supposed to have a show yesterday, but what you didn't get yesterday, you'll get today. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Mike the New Haven podcast, episode 207. Episode 206 was last Friday. That was part two of the Street Crime Chronicles, chronicling retired members of the Street Crime Unit. Richie Ficken was the guest of honor for that one. He did two stints in the unit, 88 to 93, and again, 96 to 97 was also in the gang unit. Interesting cases with him in OCIB. So check that episode out. Check that episode out, I should say, if you haven't already. So this one's bound to be unique. I've heard a lot about this man. Many people have different opinions on this man, but I figured, you know what? Let me reach out. My curiosity piqued, and thankfully for me, he said yes. And that's my next guest, who holds a unique distinction all to himself. Nobody else has this distinction. He's the only man to have ever served as both New York City Fire Commissioner and New York City Police Commissioner. He held the roles consecutively, too. First one from 1994 to 1996 as Fire Commissioner, and then as Police Commissioner of the NYPD, of course, 1996 until he retired in the summer of 2000. He's a child of both the Bronx and Long Island, enjoyed a 25-year career before all of that, of course, in what is now the modern-day DEA, used to be called different things, as we'll discuss tonight previously, as well as the U.S. Marshals Service. And that is Mr. Howard Safir, who joins me now on the Mike the New Haven podcast. Howard, welcome. How are you?
Good to be with you.
Good to have you. So the first question, like alluded to it, of course, in the introduction, you're a child of both the Bronx and Long Island. Were you born in the Bronx and then moved out to the island later?
Yep, pretty much what a lot of immigrant families did. My father was born in Russia. He came with his family to the Bronx, with the whole town, actually. He worked in the garment district. When he got a raise, we moved to Long Island, way out to Massapequa.
Which is where a lot of first responders come from, you know. It seems to be a hub, that and Deer Park for NYPD and FDNY guys.
Sure.
Yeah, definitely. So your uncle, for those of you that do not know, was a famous NYPD detective. His name was Lou Weiner, and he was best known for apprehending the notorious bank robber Willie Sutton. And it was him that you've credited as your inspiration to go into the law field yourself.
Absolutely. Uncle Lou spent a lot of time with my family. He was a Marine, fought at Guadalcanal and Okinawa. I have this picture of him standing on top of a Japanese machine gun nest, holding a Japanese flag, bare to the waist. And he was always my idol, and he used to come and tell me stories about his NYPD experiences. And there was never any doubt in my mind. I wanted to be a Marine, and I wanted to be a cop.
We're talking with Howard Safir here, former NYPD and FDNY Commissioner on the Mike the New Haven podcast. Thanks to everybody tuning in so far. And if you have a question for the Commissioner, I'll be sure to get to it at the proper time. So you went to Hofstra, where you majored in both history and political science. So it's an interesting path for somebody that wants to be in the law field. Usually they pursue something like criminal justice, which is also an equally interesting field. But why that specific major?
Oh, I've always had an interest in history and politics. And quite honestly, because I'm mature, which is spelled OLD, criminal justice was not a big major back then.
Really? Okay, that's an interesting. It is now. I mean, John Jay, that seems to be all they specialize in, for example.
Absolutely. And John Jay is a great institution.
No, it is. Absolutely. You're definitely right about that. So that brings us, I guess, into after Hofstra, getting into the federal side of law enforcement, not the local side. Nothing wrong with either. You can have a great career in both, as certainly you can attest to. Back then, the DEA was not called what it's called now, the Drug Enforcement Administration. It was, at first, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. What made you go that route? How'd that come about in your life?
Well, I started working with the, what was then the Long Island State Parkway Police. And this sergeant who was my boss came to me one day. He said, "You know, you're too smart for this job. He says, why don't you take a test and become a Fed?" So then it was the Treasury Department. I took the Treasury test, and lo and behold, in 1965, I was hired by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics.
The mission back then was unique because when people look back on the decade of the 60s, they think of the wild latter half. But really, the first half was a little bit more quiet, or a little bit more conventional. It was still kind of the old days, the golden era of what many refer to as time, at least in the United States, that is. I don't know about other parts of the world, but at least in the United States, many people who lived then in that era referred to it as such. And then you did see that crazy latter half where things got out of whack. And it wasn't just the popular uprising in drug trafficking, but it was the glorification of the culture itself. You saw that in events like Woodstock and other things that took place during that time. So being in the FBN back then during such a unique shift that was happening in real time as you lived through, what was the mission of the FBN in those days?
Well, the mission was primarily twofold. FBN, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, was the first organization to recognize organized crime. When Hoover was saying there was no organized crime, we had books full of what we called La Casa Nostra, primarily Italian organized crime figures who were selling narcotics, mainly opium and heroin. And then the second part of that was the 60s. Suddenly we had this hippie culture. The LSD became a huge problem, along with psilocybin and other hallucinogenics. And that's when I grew my hair long, grew a beard, and became an undercover agent for 6 years.
Now working, of course, very hard to believe, but nevertheless, it is an interesting evolution for you and part of the story that we'll be chronicling tonight. Before I continue with Howard, of course, a shout out to our friends in the live chat: Dawn Marie, Garrett Lindgren, retired FDNY firefighter; Pete Pranzo, retired NYPD street crime lieutenant and author; his better half Raquel watching tonight as well; Angela Ang, who's a retired 13th precinct cop; Bill Kennedy, retired sergeant in the NYPD emergency service unit; Jay Driscoll watching from across the pond in England; you Dizzy as well. And I cannot forget Joe Connor. And Joe Connor says, thank you. He says, hello, Mr. Safir. Thank you for your help during the 1999 FALN hearings.
Remember well. It was a travesty, and we tried to do what we could to turn it around.
Yeah. Joe Connor, good man. Also been on the show before previously. Make sure you check that out. And my friend Christian Flood, retired NYPD hostage negotiation detective first grade, as well as Joe Reek, currently an inspector with the Port Authority Police, formerly an inspector with the NYPD's watching as well. Hello to all of you. Thank you for tuning in. So at that time, as an undercover agent, it's all about, and I was talking about this the last episode of my friend from the street crime unit, Richie Ficken, people can know a Fed or a cop when they see one, because as I've said many times before, a street dealer is a street dealer. That's one thing. You get these higher ups in the drug world or any kind of illicit trade, they're more businessmen than they are thugs. And anybody who's a perceived threat to that business, well, you know how they react. You saw it firsthand. What was the key to establishing that alter identity and being believable?
Well, it was first, back then it was the look. I had mutton chops, I had a beard, I had hair down to my shoulder. My government car was an Austin Healey 3000, and I did not spend any time in the office. I spent a lot of time in the village. I worked undercover in San Francisco, in Miami, and actually, I was in my 20s. I thought it was amazing. I used to go home and tell my wife, because I was married then, I would tell my wife I do this for nothing, and she would tell me you do. And it was just, I felt like we were making a difference. I ended up going after some really high-level drug dealers, both Italian mafia and in the hippie community. And actually, one undercover case I was involved in San Francisco was actually on a Thanksgiving in 1968, and we arrested 22 people and made the largest seizure of LSD pills up to that time, 50,000.
Wow, 50,000. My goodness. And again, I talked about it, the glorification of the culture. People were trying to make it a mainstream thing. They still are. But that's where you guys stepped in, because listen, that debate is not for us to sit here and litigate, but you see what it does to people, normal people, otherwise normal people. They turn into complete psychopaths on that stuff.
Absolutely. And it ends up never well with people taking LSD.
No, I've been binge watching lately the old episodes of Cops, and there was an episode in Philadelphia in the early 90s, and it was very sad because I looked this up. This guy, he was a pre-med student, he had no criminal history, and somebody slipped PCP into his food. He takes that, he goes crazy, and the scene's funny, the outcome's not, because he ended up dying, sadly. But this guy ends up trying to burglarize a barbershop with no clothes on. They got to tackle him, and he's a big guy. And here I'm thinking to myself, here's a guy that probably woke up this morning, a normal civilized guy like you and me, and here he is with no clothes on, with 6 cops hanging off him as they try to tackle him. So as you said, it never ends up well.
Well, it was a huge business. The money that was made by individuals was astounding. We worked on a group called the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, and they actually were importing drugs from all over the world and distributing throughout the United States. And, I blame a lot of this on somebody I knew, Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary was a Harvard professor who espoused that using LSD was the thing to do. It was, turn on, tune in, drop out was what he would say. And I had the privilege of arresting him after we grabbed him in Afghanistan.
I have the photo right here.
There you go.
You're on the left.
I see that big guy.
It's a big man indeed. For those of you that are listening or will listen to this and won't watch on YouTube, it's then Agent Safir with his partner. Agent Safir being the left of the photo, Leary being dead center, and he looks like he's on something in that photo. He's smiling, he's happy as can be. Okay, that's not surprising. That's not surprising. I think he died. He died like in the early 90s.
Yeah, he actually became a disc jockey in Orange County, California, after he did his time, and died in the 80s.
Okay, died in the late 80s. So it was early 90s. Yeah. Well, I guess that was a perfect gig for him after he got out. You need to be a little bit wacky for radio as it is, and I can't think of anybody wackier than Mr. Leary. But I wonder what that car ride was like with him in the back seat.
He was babbling all kinds of things.
Okay, I imagine.
I remember I asked him how he had escaped from prison in Texas. And I asked him how he escaped. He says, I painted myself blue and walked out.
Sounds like something he would say. I want to ask you about this because now they're in the forefront, and you saw this particularly during the El Chapo trial. But cartels now are very, very prominent, both foreign and here in the United States, particularly when you get closer to the Mexican border in California, in Arizona, in Texas. So how prominent were they back then?
They were very prominent, and they were not as recognized as they have been in the 80s and 90s. They are now, but the Cali cartel, the Medellin cartel, were literally making billions of dollars.
Yeah, and then that's way before Escobar came in, and really, he was kind of the Gotti of the drug trade.
Escobar was involved back then, but he became the leader later on.
Right. Yeah, and he was the Gotti of the drug trade in the sense that Gotti he was very flamboyant. Yeah, he was very boisterous and very open about what he did, and he referred to it. Meaning Escobar, of course, is basically a lifeblood for the community because in the same vein, he'd be building houses, he'd be opening up stores and whatnot, and he almost became a politician.
Well, that was kind of the mantra of the large traffickers. I think you may be aware of a case I worked on somebody called Juan Mata Ballesteros. Juan Mata Ballesteros was the chief chemist for the cartel, and he was involved in murdering a DEA agent named Kiki Camarena. And he and a bunch of cartel people kidnapped him off the street in Guadalajara, took him out to a ranch in the middle of nowhere, tortured them for a bunch of days, and then killed them and buried them in shallow graves. And amazingly, they recorded the entire thing. And eventually, with the Mexican federales, we were able to get those tapes and identify who actually committed these murders. And I was privileged enough to be able to go to Honduras and snatch Juan Mata Ballesteros and bring him back to the U.S., where he's doing life plus 40 years.
And you just saw a similar case. Somebody got caught for the 1985 slaying of a DEA agent, also in Mexico. And yes. He was just apprehended, a notorious drug lord in Mexico. So, thank you for doing that. Yep, him as well. Yeah, don't want to forget about those agents. It's a dangerous job because it's not just what you do here, it's what you do abroad. And abroad, it's a different ballgame. And certainly my friends, not only in the Marshals, as we'll talk about in a little bit, in the DEA, but also U.S. Customs back then can attest to that.
Absolutely. The jobs they do, it takes tremendous amount of courage. I'm very respectful of all of those organizations.
Of course, we're talking with Howard Safir, former FDNY NYPD commissioner, also 25-year veteran of the federal law enforcement, various federal law enforcement agencies, I should say. Now, I know the guy who brought him down. His name's Lou Diaz, great guy. He's been on this show previously. But the Nicky Barnes case, the council, as he referred to his circle of dealers, and he was, I mean, they literally called him Mr. Untouchable. It took forever to bring him down. How much of a hand did you have in that?
I didn't have too much of a hand in that, quite honestly, because I had left New York by then. But
Okay.
my former partner, Don Ferrarone, was actually the case agent on that. And he did a magnificent job of getting Nicky Barnes, who I believe was responsible for over 100 murders.
Yeah. And ruined Harlem, too, for a period.
Oh, yeah. Well, back then, the biggest drug traffickers in New York were in Harlem.
Mm-hmm. Yep, no doubt about that. It's eventually by this point, it had been the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, and then it became the DEA. You were the assistant director right before you left for the Marshals. So tell me about what that job entailed.
Well, basically, my job at that point as assistant director was to run a lot of special operations, the air wing, some of our major conspiracy cases, and as well as evaluating the offices throughout the country.
Interesting thing to do. And I mean, that must have taught you discipline and also the ability, I mean, not that you were lacking in social skills, but also the ability to further sharpen those skills because you're dealing with so many people at once. It had to be pretty stressful.
I've never really felt a lot of stress, but the job was great, and it taught me a lot. I had a tremendous boss who mentored me and taught me how to, in quotes, play the federal game in Washington, which really is complex.
Yeah.
And because of it, I was fortunate to be successful.
I would say. So you left for the Marshals in 1978. Why the switch?
Well, what happened is the director of the Marshals Service was a man named John Toomey, and the administrator of DEA was a man named Peter Bensinger. And at that time, the Witness Security Division of the Marshals Service was under attack by the Congress and the press for not doing their job right. So Toomey called Bensinger and said, "You have a smart young guy who could fix this." And I had no idea what was going on. I got called up to the boss's office and he said, "I want you to go to the Marshal Service for 1 year and fix this program. And then when you come back, I'm going to give you a big job somewhere in the organization." So I said, "Okay." I said, "I'm not real high on the U.S. Marshals, but if that's what you want me to do, I'm going to go." So I did, and I went on what they call a detail. I was still a DEA employee, but I was loaned to the Marshal Service for what was supposed to be a year. At the end of the go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I guess your opinion changed on them in that year.
Well, what I found out was the Marshal Service was full of terrific people, but they just weren't getting support. They didn't have a lot of leadership. They didn't have a lot of people telling them they were doing a good job, and they didn't have any resources. I showed up at the Witness Security Division. They had no computers. They had no policy. They had no procedures. And that's what I did over the next year, along with a lot of help from a lot of smart people, and was able to bring a lot of good people in the Marshal Service into the Witness Security Division, and we fixed it. And today, I'm very proud of it. They are now telling countries all over the world how to do witness security. But at the end of that year, the director of the Marshal Service called me to his office and he said, "We want you to stay." And they offered me a big promotion. And they said, "You'll be in charge of all worldwide operations of the Marshal Service." And we talked a little bit about it, and it was a great opportunity, so I took it.
And it ended up, like I said, being a great job for 12 years, a dozen years underneath your belt. And that's such an interesting program because sometimes you do have high profile people that testify in high profile cases. And there's that fine line between transparency with these people and also safety. If it's a high profile murder, drug case, La Cosa Nostra cases, you want to keep these people safe. And also, you understand the job of the press, but you got to keep the press away too, because too much of that can quickly turn into a bad thing. Tell me about walking that fine line, and without giving tricks of the trade away, of course, on the surface level, how one can do it successfully.
Well, first of all, the answer to every question about who's in the program is we don't affirm or deny.
Smart.
So that's the first answer. Second, it's a huge logistical nightmare. People have a lot of misconceptions about the Witness Security Division. They think, there are a lot of innocent people in it. 97% of the people in the Witness Security Program are convicted felons who make deals with the government to get lenient sentences or not go to jail by giving up their comrades. So they're right. So, the criteria is danger. And so you have to take not just them, but you take their entire family. And sometimes, this sounds funny, but it's also true. Sometimes you not only take their family, you take the mistresses as well, because the criteria is dangerous. And then you take them from living in an environment where they do whatever they want, where they have lots of money, fancy cars, fancy houses, and you have to convert them into people living in different areas with different names, with different backgrounds, working at real jobs. And besides being a logistical nightmare, it's a psychological nightmare for the families. So it's a very difficult program, but the good news is, in the entire time that the program's been in operation, we've never lost a witness.
That's the key. That's the key. And it takes stringent tactics like that and many more that we don't know about. We don't need to know
It
about.
does, and we could spend hours talking about it, but we have other things to talk about.
Yes, we do. So there's also the coordination aspect with local law enforcement. You guys are going into given cities, dealing with various agencies, looking for these people in the first place. And that's an interesting thing to navigate, which you later have to do on the other side of the coin as NYPD commissioner. But tell me about doing it from the federal side.
Well, on the federal side, we don't tell anybody in local law enforcement that we're putting witnesses in their location unless they're compromised.
Okay.
And then, of course, we have to go in and tell local law enforcement that the person you just arrested is a federal witness and he needs certain kinds of protection. We don't get him out of crimes, but there are places that they can be put incarcerated where they won't be killed.
Okay, that makes sense. And at that point, you have to consider it a success. Of course, like you said, you never lost a witness. So that brings us, I guess, into the late 80s. The Marshals Service has turned around significantly, but you're nearing the end. Around 88, 89, is that where you started to think about retiring for the first time?
It was. I felt I had accomplished everything that I wanted to. My children were about to go off to college, graduating from high school, and I had spent a tremendous amount of time during my career away from my family, and I felt that it was time to go into the private sector and retire. I was eligible to retire, so I did, and started a small company in Virginia in the security and investigative business, and was doing fine. And then in 1994, I got a call.
And that call came from Rudy, of course,
Yes.
and that was to become the 29th FDNY commissioner. Now, it's interesting, and I was talking about this off the air with a few guys in the lead up to interviewing you. Usually, the commissioner of either department is somebody that was on the street, that was a cop or was a fireman, knows what it's like to battle a fire, knows what it's like to work a case and arrest somebody and have success in that regard. And while you certainly knew the law enforcement side, as we'll talk about later, on the fire side, obviously you didn't know anything. But that's what the FDNY kind of needed at the time, because it was a department in, dare I say, disarray.
Well, it was a real surprise to me because, I was hoping Rudy would call me and tell me that he wanted me to be police commissioner, because I knew Rudy a very long time. I knew him when he was an assistant U.S. attorney. And then when I became chief of operations of the Marshals Service, he was the associate attorney general at the Department of Justice. And basically, I reported to him. So we got to know each other very well, both professionally, and we became very good friends. Right. And so when he called me and said, I want you to be fire commissioner, I I honestly didn't know what to say. And then finally I said, Rudy, I don't know anything about fire. I said, how the heck am I going to be fire commissioner? And he said, you know how to lead, you know how to manage. He says, they need somebody to be their advocate. They need somebody to help them progress as a department. And he says, I think you can do it. And then he kind of, as an aside, said, you never know how long a police commissioner is going to last. And he said, I'm not promising you anything, but if that job comes open, we can talk.
There you go. And you would talk 2 years later.
Quite honestly, that was the magic words for me, because there's nothing I would have rather been than New York City Police Commissioner.
But I think you came to love being fire commissioner, as we'll talk about.
I did. I did. You know, when you're not familiar, I was a little familiar because both my brother-in-law and my nephew are both retired firefighters.
Okay.
So I knew a little bit about what they did, but not really any of the basics of what happened. And when I got to the fire department, I found, again, an organization full of great people, incredibly brave people, really nice people, real family organization, but they weren't getting any respect from the government. I'll give you a perfect example. I vowed when I became fire commissioner that I would have dinner in every firehouse in the city. That was over 200. So I started going from one firehouse to the other, wanting to meet the people who did the work. And we would have dinner. I can't tell you how much lasagna and chili I ate that year. But I'm at a firehouse one day and somebody says, the mayor's on the phone. He needs to talk to you. I said, okay. And he's telling me something and he says, I need to fax you something. So I asked the captain of the firehouse, what's your fax number? And he starts laughing. He says, fax. He says, they don't even give us ribbons for our manual typewriters. So, that's when I began to realize that from a technological standpoint, they really needed help. They needed computers. They needed fax machines. They needed somebody who was going to be their advocate and get them stuff. I used to joke that I didn't want to bring the fire department into the 21st century. I just wanted to bring them into the 20th century because they really needed help. And so I used whatever chits I could with Rudy, and he was very responsive. And we started getting technology, and we started getting equipment. And then I think it was in March of the year that I became the fire commissioner, we had a terrible fire.
Watt Street.
Right, Watt Street, and we lost 2 firefighters in the fire, and a captain John Drennan was incredibly burned and lingered in the burn center at New York Hospital for 45 days before, unfortunately, he passed away. And when I went to the hospital that night and saw, unfortunately, the 2 firefighters who had passed away, and John Drennan, Tom Von Essen, who I became good friends with eventually, in fact, recommended him to succeed me, was there. He was the union president, and he said to me, Commissioner, he said, if we had bunker gear, this never would have happened. And quite honestly, I had no idea what bunker gear was. And he explained to me that bunker gear was fire retardant clothing, and that if firefighters had them instead of the rubber suits they were wearing and getting burned horribly, that it would save a lot of lives and a lot of injuries each year. So Rudy came to the hospital, and I said to him, we got to get bunker gear. And Tom had told me it was going to be $12 million. And Rudy walked around, he looked at what was happening, and in typical Rudy Giuliani fashion, he said, do it. And within, I guess, 6 months to a year, every firefighter in New York had bunker gear, and burns went down, I think, about 60 or 70%.
There was also something else that you did that was really great, because an operation that really needed your help at the time was the fire marshal's operation, which is such a great operation now. And
Yes.
one of the things that you did, talking about picking the right people for the right jobs, you put Pete Gansey in charge of who eventually became chief of department and lost his life in the line of duty on 9/11, sadly. But you put him in charge of the fire marshals, and in the 3 years that he had it from 94 to 97, he turned it around.
Absolutely. One of the things one of my early bosses told me was that one of the keys to being a good leader was finding good people, put them in the right positions, get the hell out of their way, and be there if they need you. And that was Pete Gansey. Pete was an incredible human being. Uh, you know, I wasn't surprised when I heard that he had died in 9/11 because he was always willing to do anything that was necessary to get the job done, and he wouldn't ask anybody to do anything that he wouldn't have done. He was an incredible hero and a tremendous guy.
I remember your exact quote in his obituary was, "You wouldn't find Pete 5 miles away in some command center," end quote.
Absolutely. And he also had a great sense of humor and it was just a pleasure to be around. And, I considered him one of my guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And he was definitely the perfect man later on to be chief of department for that department because he lived and breathed the fire service. I think he got that job in 1999, a couple years before.
I'll tell you a quick funny story about Pete.
Please do.
When I became police commissioner, there was always a little bit of headbutting between fire and police, specifically between emergency services and fire rescue.
Yes.
So they were all trying to get to the scene of an accident first and take command. So we were having meetings between myself and the fire department. And of course, I was advocating for the police department. And Pete looked at me and he said, "Boy, that worm has turned."
Oh, man, that sounds like him. And it's funny because I remember there was something that occurred, and I'm sure you remember the book because you probably approved him to do this project. Sam Katz's book, Anytime, Anywhere, on ESU. And I have a mini series on the show with interviewing retired members of the unit. And there's a job. Oh yeah, it's quite the unit. And Henry Medina and Seth Garr, who were a couple guys from Two Truck in Harlem, happened to be on patrol. And they saw a fire. So what they do, because for those of you that don't know, ESU does carry the air packs. You see firemen use as well, as they refer to them, Scott packs. They slapped a couple of Scott packs on, and they can't fight the fire, but they went in and evacuated people. And they were overcome with smoke, but thankfully they were all right. So Sam puts this in the book. A couple of firemen come by. I think it's a chief that looks at Medina and Garr, and they're all covered in soot, but they did a great job. Everybody got out. And they said to Medina and Garr, "If you want to do our job, why don't you go and take the test?" And Medina and Garr shoot back and said, "Well, if you guys would get here on time, we wouldn't have to."
Sounds right.
Yeah, that was how it was back in 1997. But, of course, it's a little bit different now. It's a lot better now, thankfully. And I have a question here in the chat. Comes from Joe Maliga, retired corrections officer, and also was a firefighter in the corrections field at the prison that he served at. And his question is, what was the funniest thing what was the funniest thing he saw in the fire service that he could say now? I think he's trying to say.
I guess he wants a funny story from the fire service.
Yeah, I think that's what he's asking about. That might be a typo there on his part.
Another wonderful guy in the fire service was Chief Donald Burns.
Yes.
Who was chief of operations and somebody who I had tremendous respect for. And it was early on in my tenure, and there was a fire at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and it was a factory full of rubber gloves. And this thing was burning and burning and burning. And I was there about 4 hours in the middle of the night. And it didn't look like we were making any progress. I went up to Don Burns and I said, "Chief, are we going to get this thing?" He looked at me, smiled. He said, "Boss, they all eventually go out."
And he was right. He was right. Of course. Don Burns, another great chief who gave his life on 9/11.
Totally.
Yeah, another hero. 1996, that brings us to the EMS merger. And this was a year after all the police forces consolidated into one. Now there's another merger that needs to happen. I think they were unhappy with the personnel, the level of personnel, and also the response times in the city in regards to EMS. They always seem to be understaffed. And so the idea was proposed. Initially, I think the police department wanted a hand in it, but because if you go out to Nassau County, for example, it's under the police department. But in New York City, the fire department got it. And this was really your last act before becoming PC. So getting it underneath your banner at the time, the FDNY, tell me about the process that went into that.
Well, there was a lot of resistance.
Naturally.
EMS didn't want to become what they thought was going to be servants to firefighters. Firefighters didn't want to get involved in medical stuff, although I later got them involved in medical stuff before I left. We could talk about that a little later, but I needed somebody who knew how to deal with people, had great administrative skills, and was tough. So I selected Dan Nigro, who eventually became fire commissioner and became a good friend of mine. Dan did a tremendous job figuring out how to base them, how to get them into the organization, and how to build a career path for them to become firefighters if they wanted to. And that helped a great deal. It had a lot of bumps, but we got it done, and it's the way it should be. And I think we tremendously improved response time, and we started what I had alluded to a little bit ago. We started a tiered system of response to cardiac arrests, where firefighters would get there first and use defibrillators to get the individual breathing again, and then the EMS people would get there, stabilize them, and save their lives. And so what we did is we introduced something called CFRD to the fire department, where now every engine company is equipped with defibrillators and they respond to cardiac arrests. And it was interesting the way that happened. I was walking through headquarters one day, and a young lieutenant said to me, "Commissioner, do you know that we have the worst cardiac arrest survival rate in New York City in the world?" And I said, "I look just the way you look." I said, "I did not know that." He said, "I'll tell you why." He says the average response time of the EMS is 6 minutes or 8 minutes, or sometimes 12 minutes. Yeah. He says the average response time of the FDNY is 4 minutes or under. He said if we could get there with defibrillators, we could stabilize somebody until the EMS got there. So we introduced that, again, with a lot of resistance from a lot of firefighters, but they eventually came around, and we started saving a lot of lives.
A terminology that gets thrown around a lot in the FDNY is first due work. It's usually in reference to a fire, the first due company that's on the scene. But just imagine, as an example, in New York City, anything can happen. You have some poor guy that's having a heart attack down the street from a firehouse. The fire department's not responding to that. Instead, you're waiting for an EMS ambulance, maybe on the other side of the borough, to try to get there. And that person could die in that time span. But now with the CFRD runs, who knows how many lives have been saved?
Right. Many, many. And this is just an interesting fact. You know why there are so many firehouses in the city?
Why?
Because they were developed when you located them where a horse could get from that firehouse to a fire within 5 minutes.
Right. They used to use the horses back in the day, like the 1800s.
Yes, so that's why there's over 200 firehouses in New York City.
That makes sense. Yeah, and I think into the early 1900s, before the first engine came around, they were horse-drawn. They were specifically horse-drawn company. So it's interesting that you bring that up. So that brings us to April of '96, and Bill Bratton leaves, and then you come in as the police commissioner. You go from being the 29th fire commissioner to the 39th police commissioner. Now, when you come in, it's a department that is in good shape. It's a city that crime-wise is in better shape from the start of the decade to now. Crime's going down, but there's still a lot of work to do. And obviously coming in, you want to make sure that that trend keeps going and crime doesn't go back up again. So you're coming into a pretty good situation. Tell me, what was the first goal upon becoming PC?
Well, good and bad situation. Good because Bill Bratton and his team did a great job and crime was going down. Bad because suddenly I parachuted him from the outside, never have been an NYPD cop, and a lot of suspicion. And when you take over an organization where somebody leaves not under their own power, there's a lot of resentment around. So it took a bit of time to figure out who was going to be on the team, who was not going to be on the team. And the most important thing was to support what I had at the time, 45,248 cops to make sure that they had what they needed to do the job, and that when they did something positive, it was recognized, and when they did something negative, if it was not an act of commission, that they were treated fairly, and if it was an act of commission, that they were disciplined. So all of those things had to be taken into account. And again, running the NYPD is like running an army. I had 54,000 people under my command, including civilians. So a tremendous amount of thing. And first thing I do is I had to put my team together. I had to find the first deputy commissioner, who I did find, Tony Simonetti, who was great, and then deputy commissioners and chiefs, and I had to evaluate each chief to see not only if they were doing a good job, but if they wanted to do a good job under my command. And I'll tell you a story without identification. Some chief who had been there a long time and was very well known walked into my office, and he basically said, "Commissioner, this is a great job. Go to dinners, go to ceremonies, let us do what we do." And I sat him down and explained to him that that's not the way it's going to be. I didn't fall off a truck. Been in law enforcement for a very long time. I need to learn a lot about the NYPD, and you need to help me. But I'm going to be involved every single day, and you'll be in here briefing me 8 o'clock every morning. Make a long story short, he didn't last too long.
I imagine. The gall, though, to step into your office and say that, it takes some chutzpah.
It does take a lot of chutzpah. But on the other hand, the majority of chiefs were great. They understood what the mission was. And over the next 4.5 years, I had a tremendous time working with them. And we reduced crime. When I say we, I always mean the men and women of the NYPD. They reduced crime under my tenure more than any police commissioner in history. In fact, I remember standing under the ball that January in Times Square, and there had not been a year in the last 3 decades with homicides under 1,000. And I got the notice at midnight that we were at 9-something, and it was the first time in 3 decades. It made me very proud of the people who were working with me.
And that number, as recently as 2018, got all the way down to 289, which is incredible to think.
Well, it's amazing because the concern now is it's beginning to go back in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
Along with shootings, and people have often heard me say, to me, a shooting is a homicide with bad aim.
Yeah, that's fair. That's true. And you're seeing a lot of them right now, amongst other crimes, particularly subway crime. Got something here from Scott Wagner. He's a retired hostage negotiation team detective, as well as a homicide detective who worked in Manhattan. And he says, I give the PC a lot of credit for surrounding himself with great people at the time. This is why we were so successful under his watch. He treated the detective bureau very well. And before you respond to that, it's worth noting, Scott spent the first 14 years of his career in the housing police. So he came over with the merger, and he gives you a lot of credit for treating the bureau very well.
Well, I appreciate that. But again, when you have good people, you got to support them and make sure they get what they need.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a test early on because a month after you took over is when Vinny Giudice got killed in the Bronx on that domestic call. He got shoved into the mirror and his leg got cut and it severed an artery. And that was such a hard case because you see, normally there's no good way to die, obviously, but you see police officers, particularly in New York, usually it's an accident on the way to the car, they're shot or something like that. This was so unusual, and he was so young, and he was a gifted cop at that. And this was in the Bronx. It's not too long after the Larry Davis controversy. So handling that as the first line of duty death under your tenure, tell me about that.
It was tragic, and it was an up and down because when we first got to Jacoby Hospital, they told us he was going to be okay. And I left there, and it was really early on my tenure. And I left there feeling, well, thank God, he's not going to die. And then later that night, unfortunately, he was gone. And, dealing with the families, and, that's the worst part of being a fire or police commissioner, is when you have to tell loved ones that their firefighter or their police officer is gone. And you get different reactions at different times. And whatever it is, you just have to be there for them. And then you have to make sure that you're not just there for them that night or that week, but you have to be there for them forever.
Right. Right. And there's a saying, Jimmy O'Neill said it on my show a few years ago, we don't forget. And that goes for both departments. They do not forget. They still remember. It doesn't matter if it was 100 years ago, last year, yesterday. They don't forget their fallen brothers and sisters.
Now, that's the worst part of the job, is having to get up and give a eulogy about a fallen firefighter or police officer. And unfortunately, I think it was 23 between the two that I lost while I was in both jobs.
Yeah, and that year, 96, was, I mentioned in this last episode, that was really violent because the month before you took over, Kevin Gillespie, rather, from Street Crime, was killed on a car stop that was underneath Bratton right before he left. And then later that year, Freddie Narvaez and Brian Jones, 5 days apart, and then Charlie Davis to round it off in December.
Yep.
Yeah, not good, but nevertheless, you guys always handled it very well, and you're very good with the families, and that goes for both departments, and they certainly deserve a lot of credit for that. You had the TWA Flight 800 crash out in Long Island. Emergency service was sent out to handle that, and that was handled beautifully. But then it was 1997. People really forget that between the first attack in the World Trade Center in 1993 and the follow-up in 2001, it's not like the terrorists just stopped and said, okay, hang on, guys, time out. We're going to revise the game plan here. No, they were still trying. You get the UN letter bombs job in 97 in January to start off. A month later, the Empire State Building shooting. And then 5 months after that, that job out in Brooklyn where the Hamas terrorists were going to blow up the Atlantic Avenue subway.
Well, the Brooklyn was the one that really, we really, strange to say, but we really dodged the bullet on that one.
Yeah, I'll say.
What happened there was 3 Palestinian youths crossed the border from Vancouver to the U.S., and the inspector, customs or immigration, whoever it was, asked them if they had ever been members of a terrorist organization. And one of them says, well, I was once accused of being Hamas. And the officer said, well, report back here in 90 days for a hearing. And off they go to Brooklyn. They construct 3 bombs with big nails and plastic explosives and 2 switches on each bomb. And lucky for us, one of the participants in that group approaches a Long Island Railroad cop at Atlantic Avenue and says, I'm living with 3 guys who are going to bomb subways. And he was smart enough to call his boss, who called us. We got a translator in there, and he told them they have 3 bombs. They're going on the subway tomorrow morning, and they're going to blow up Jews, is what he said. And he gave us the layout of the apartment, where they were, what was going to happen. We got it surrounded. We evacuated the whole area, and ESU went in. And as they went in, one of these young men went to flip a switch on a bomb, and the ESU officer shot him and prevented a tremendous tragedy. So yes, the terrorists were still active in between the 2 World Trade Centers, as I believe they are still active today.
Of course, and I know the guys that handled that. Joe Dolan and Dave Martinez were among the guys on the entry team from Truck 7 and 8. It was a task force mixed between members of those 2 emergency service squads, and then the bomb squad guys. Heroes all, absolutely. And the bomb squad guys that went and defused it is Paul Yerkou and Rich Teamsma. And it was funny because there's a book on this. It's called 7 Shots by Jennifer Hunt. It's a great book. And after the shooting, one of the lieutenants on scene, I think his name was John English, he's like, holy Christ, I hope there's bombs in here because we just shot 2 people. and there were. And Paul and Rich,
I remember that.
Yeah, they took care of business and they defused those bombs successfully. So, how much, because again, we kind of had an idea because it was the year before Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, the helicopters that were shot down in Somalia in 1993. A year after that, the embassy bombing. And I'm sure you're thinking, man, if we're not on our A game, this could be us. This could be New York. And eventually, sadly, it was.
That's what keeps you up at night.
How much thought did you give to terrorism back then, even as you fought, even as you worked to fight urban crime?
I gave a lot of thought to it because having been in the federal government, I knew a lot about what was happening overseas. I did a lot of work with that group at Langley, so we knew a lot about what was happening. And of
Right.
course, John O'Neill, another hero, was talking about, you know, Osama bin Laden constantly and sending up the alarms, sometimes not being listened to.
Yeah, that was another thing. And I remember Chief Anamone saying that they would have briefings after hours. They'd sit, share some cigars, and John would talk
Yep.
about Osama bin Laden, the threat he posed. And I think a couple months after you left as police commissioner is when the USS Cole bombing happened in
Yep.
Yemen in 2000. That was the last major attack before 9/11.
Well, you know,
There's, go ahead.
fortunately, uh, one of the advantage of having been a Fed was I knew all the Feds in the city.
Right.
And another hero, Jim Kallstrom, and I got along tremendously. And Jim would very often come over and brief me on what was going on.
Yeah. Well, I remember there's clips of this on YouTube. It was a PBS report when the press conference right after the Brooklyn job is being given. Rudy's in the front talking. Jim Kallstrom's right behind him, and you're right to Jim's left. And Jim passed
Yep.
away last year at the age of 78. But you guys were always in lockstep, and that had, as to your point, that had to be a huge plus because sometimes the relationship between the feds and the NYPD, as you know, it hasn't always been harmonious. But having somebody like you with federal experience that had to quash a lot of those beefs.
We had a monthly dinner, usually at the Friars Club, where we would all get together and talk about what was going on. In fact, just to give you an idea, you mentioned TWA 300. We were all at that dinner, and suddenly everybody's pagers went off simultaneously. And we were all getting notified of what happened. And we thought initially it was a terrorist act.
Yeah. Because Ramzi Youssef was on trial at the time, one of the World Trade Center bombers, of
Yes.
course. And one of the things he was on trial for, which would give credence to this thought, is trying to blow up American airliners.
Exactly. In the Philippines.
Yep. Yep. And one of them, I think he wanted to take out Bill Clinton in Manila. And that was one of the plots of bin Laden. When John Miller interviewed him in 1998, asked him point blank about it, if you remember.
Yep.
Yeah. There's a couple of things he did as commissioner that were great. Firearms training. It's dangerous to be a cop anywhere. It's especially dangerous to be a cop in a big city. And there is no city like New York City. Firearms incidents were 344 in 1995. By 1999, that number was down to 155. So tell me about that.
Well, we did we put those machines in Rodman's neck, the shoot don't shoot machines. We made sure every officer went through it, and if they did well, we congratulated them. If they didn't do well, we showed them what they did wrong, and we made sure that they understood that the rule was very simple: you shoot at somebody in defense of your life or another's, and otherwise you keep that thing holstered.
Right. Right. And that was key because it can mitigate potentially a lot of dangerous situations where maybe a cop doesn't mean to do this. The intentions are good, but you pull out your gun and that can exacerbate an already very high tension situation.
Well, we also continued something that Bill Bratton started called verbal judo, where we taught people how to de-escalate situations with words rather than force.
Right. And that's working still to this day.
And it worked.
Yeah, that worked a lot. And it also keeps the safety of the officer in mind. Can you stop every line of duty death? No. I mean, obviously, unfortunately, they continued. You remember Tony Sanchez in 97 and certainly Mosamillo, Carrington, and Carter in 98. Sometimes the situations are dangerous and they lead way to violence because of the nature of the job. But there's a lot more cops out there that didn't get hurt, didn't get killed, definitely because of that.
Absolutely. And, not only did shootings go down, civilian complaints went down. Every year I was commissioner.
There's also a personnel regiment that you implemented that they're still using to this day, actually, the NYPD is, and that's Operation Condor. For those not familiar with it, explain what it is.
Well, Condor is just sending cops where you need them and making sure that they're in the right situation and that you prioritize neighborhoods where crime's taking place.
There's also the flip side to handling crisis. I mentioned when cops get hurt or killed, and you had situations obviously out of your control. First, there was the horrific Luima incident in '97, and you handled that well as you could under the circumstances, I should say. Then there was Diallo in 1999, same thing, out of your control, and you handled that as well as you could in that situation as well. So, what is there's always those war room briefings, right? You talked about how
Right.
running the NYPD is like running an army. When those two incidents happened, or even when a cop is just accused of any kind of wrongdoing, what is the discussion at 1PP like?
Very simple. When Charlie Campisi, who was the chief of internal affairs, called me and told me about Luima, my initial reaction was I didn't believe it because it was so horrendous that a police officer would sodomize a arrestee with a broomstick. And Charlie said, we've checked it out and it happened. So I sat down with my command staff, and Luima was Haitian. And I said, the first thing we have to do is we have to get all of the leaders of the Haitian community in here, not tomorrow, tonight. And we got all the Haitian community leaders in, and I promised them that if in fact what was alleged was true, I would make sure that the police officers were not only fired, but that they would go to jail. And that's exactly what I did, working very closely with Zach Carter, who was the U.S. Attorney in Brooklyn. We made sure that that chief perpetrator was immediately sent for a very long prison sentence. And again, we hear about the blue wall of silence. There was a very brave young cop in that 70th precinct who came forward and confirmed what actually happened.
Right. And good on him for doing that, because you want to keep your force, any business, but especially profession like law enforcement, right. You got to keep it as clean as possible.
The Diallo thing was a different thing.
Yeah.
What happened in the Diallo thing is that four street crime cops were out early in the AM looking for a rapist. They saw an individual who looked not like the rapist, almost like the twin of the rapist. In fact, when we eventually caught the rapist at his trial, the judge said to him at sentencing, if not for you, Amadou Diallo would still be alive. And here's the tragedy. It was one of these Murphy Law things. If anything could go wrong, it went wrong that night. Diallo was kind of going in and out of buildings, looked like he was sneaking in and out of buildings. And they followed him into a building. The officer from street crime who was talking to him asked him his name and told him to show his hands. Instead, he reached for his wallet on his right waist. And the officer in this dark hallway thought that he was reaching for a gun, incorrectly, but not intentionally, and fired the first shots. Diallo was leaning against a red painted wall that was reflective. Some of those shots went ricocheted and went right over the heads of the cops on the stoop outside. One of the cops fell backwards. The other cops thought he had been shot. And then they all opened up, fired 41 shots. Nobody went out to kill Amadou Diallo. It was in incredibly bad circumstances, probably some misjudgments, but nobody intentionally did anything wrong. And that's why, although I took a tremendous amount of heat for it in all of the tabloids, I didn't give up these four cops. I made sure I supported them. I supported the change of venue. And Burt Roberts, who was former district attorney in the Bronx, had retired, and pro bono made sure that change of venue took place. And as you know, all those four police officers were found innocent of murdering Diallo. And it was a tragedy. It was a horrible tragedy. But it wasn't anything like the Luima case, which was an intentional harming of an arrestee.
Right. We talked about commission and omission. earlier, and to your point, that was the exact case. And I remember hearing about that because I will say this years ago, and he's since passed away. And I know you two had your differences, but back in 2018, I had Lenny Levin on the show, formerly of NYPD Confidential and Newsday, and he did give you credit in this regard, where he said about those incidents, you handled it well, and that at your core, you were an honest person, and I think it reflected with that.
Yeah, well, as I've always said about Lenny, and Lenny didn't only just attack me. He attacked every police commissioner that was that he was tenured while he was at his job.
That much is certain.
But I used to kid about Lenny. He didn't want to get it right. He wanted to get it first.
Yeah, that was true. Lenny was certainly tenacious at what he did. And I think now he'd be having a field day. I was telling this to Rocco Periscindola a while ago, who's on the show, who's the police bureau chief of the Daily News. That guy now, I mean, it was funny, though. He did say at the end of that interview that these days, meaning 2018 at the time, he found himself defending the police department more so than he did, going after them.
Well, in 2018, he was one of the few.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. Interesting guy, Lenny. I miss him. He was a friend of mine. Good man, gone too soon. He died of cancer, that terrible disease that took him away from us back in May of 2020. So before I ask about your retirement, because I want to make sure I don't keep you too long, we're at the hour mark. You had a lot of fun moments too. We're both Yankee fans. You were busy during that time. Parade in '96 and 3 straight parades from 1998 through 2000. I'm curious. I know the Chiefs' role of it. I know the ESU guys and how they go into planning about it. The Bomber Squad guys too. But what's a commissioner's role in planning out fun moments like that?
Well, the job is primarily to review the plans put together by the uniformed force and to make sure that it's with my expertise, because one of the things I was in charge of when I was chief of operations of the Marshals Service was the security of all federal judges and all federal buildings in the United States. So I had a tremendous background in protecting buildings and people. And I wanted to make sure that the plans that were presented were going to make sure that people had a good time, that they weren't unduly restricted, but that we were not going to have any kind of disturbances. And, I have to give Lou Animo credit. He was a master at putting together those kind of plans. He was my chief of department for most of my tenure.
Yeah, 1990. Well, you got there in 96. He left in June of 99.
Right.
He would have been chief of department before he got named that the year prior under Bratton. But yeah, interesting guy. And when I remember when I put the promo out for him a year ago when he was going to come on the show, all these cops on LinkedIn that I'm connected with came out of the woodwork. How much they love him. They still love him to this day.
He's a cop's cop.
Yeah. Perfect way to describe him. I concur. And also, I should mention, even though you were fire commissioner for this, again, another happy moment early on, Ranger Stanley Cup Parade in 1994. So you had quite a bit of parades under you. We might need to bring you back. That way, it could rub off on the Yankees and they can go all the way.
Well, I take credit for the 3 World Series.
As you should. I don't blame you. As you should. And did you watch the Derek Jeter documentary at all?
I watched part of it, not all of it.
Yeah, I haven't watched all of it yet, but I'll have to. I remember, I'm sure it brought back a lot of good memories for you. So summer of 2000, much like, I guess, towards the end of your federal law enforcement career, you're thinking to yourself, I imagine, man, I was fire commissioner, I was police commissioner. I've had a lot of fun, but you know what? I think I finally got it out of my system, at least on the public sector side. When did you make up your mind, yeah, it's time to put in my papers and retire again?
Things were big. Well, first, I had accomplished pretty much what I wanted, which was crime was at its lowest levels in many, many years. And that job is 24 hours a day, 365. I can't remember a week when I didn't get woken up at 2 a.m. to go see something. Somebody got shot, somebody got hurt, somebody did something stupid, but you were always out. And that takes a toll on your family. And we got to go to a lot of fun events, but we also got to miss a lot of events as well. So I just said to myself that things were beginning to get cyclical. I was going to the same breakfasts, to the same meetings. Things were going well, and I've always had a philosophy, and sometimes I teach a class or two at Fordham in leadership, and I tell people that one very important thing is you should never leave when somebody wants you to leave. You should leave when you want to leave. And it was time to go, and I never forget this. I walked into Rudy's office and I said, I'm going to leave. And he looked at me and says, you don't have to. And I said, I know, but it's my time. It's time to go. And I recommended somebody to replace me. And unfortunately, Rudy didn't follow that advice.
Well, yeah, that's that's a different story for a different day. Bernie, and he was the second most popular Bernie in New York during that time, right behind Bernie Williams, of course. But Bernie Carrick came in and was commissioner for a year, and then Ray Kelly came in. It's a little buffer period from 2000 to 2001, right before Ray came back a second time. Just a quick note before I move into briefly your two books and then the concluding segment. You know, a year later is when 9/11 happens. You'd been so invested in the fire department in your 2 years there. You knew a lot of people, most of the higher ranks of the FDNY, including your predecessor as commissioner, Bill Feehan, who had stayed on as first deputy, were killed in the line of duty. Obviously, you had a big investment in the NYPD. 23 of your cops lost their lives that day. Where were you on that morning?
I was home on East 68th Street. I saw the first one go into the Trade Center, and I immediately got a call from CNN asking if I could come down to the roof of their building, which looked over the World Trade Center, and comment on what I thought. And of course, I knew right away it was terrorism. You know, it was a bluebird day. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. And of course, that was confirmed immediately when the second plane hit. And I was actually on the roof of the CNN building looking down at the World Trade Center when the second plane hit.
And after that, I remember you saying that, you know, there's clips of you speaking on CNN and Fox News that it was a war zone, and it was.
Absolutely.
But the commander in you, obviously having been commissioner of both departments, had to be eaten at you, for lack of a better way to word it, to not be down there with your guys and gals.
I regret to this day that I was not there, because I felt I could have helped a great deal. And, you know, I did offer to help, and I did do some stuff with the city afterwards. I was down there the second day, and, you know, it was still burning, and people were still working on the pile, and it was horrific. I mean, it was something you would never think about happening in New York City.
Right. And the game has certainly changed in the almost 21 years since then. Hard to believe it's about to be 21 years. My God.
Yep.
And as I said, the last thing we'll get to before the concluding segment, which is the rapid fire, you did write a couple of books. One of them is called Security. I have the link in the description of this episode on YouTube if you guys want to go and get Howard's books. Tell me about the process of putting a book together. It's almost as hard as being police commissioner or fire commissioner.
Actually, harder, because it wasn't the book I wanted to write. The publisher wanted a how-to book rather than a book about me. Right. And that book may yet come, who knows? But it was difficult, but I had a lot of help from a lot of people, and I'm proud of the product that came out. I think it's a good how-to lead and how-to police, and certainly didn't make much money from it, but that's okay.
Yeah, but maybe it's still being utilized from a tactical standpoint, because it came out in 2003, right after that terrible day. So who knows how many police departments, especially on the heels of that, especially in larger cities.
I've gotten some great comments from cops who have read it. Yeah, and that's very gratifying.
Yeah, that's the best compliments you can get. Forget any kind of professional reviewer. The men and the women on the street, as you said, that's who you want to hear from. So it's now time for the rapid fire. 5 hit run questions from me, 5 hit run answers from you. You can say pass if you want. Are you ready?
Yep.
All right. First, as I said, we're both Yankee fans. Top 5 favorite Yankees of all time.
Phil Rizzuto, Yogi Berra, Paul O'Neill. He's one of my favorites. Lou Gehrig, of course. And then you're going to be surprised at the fifth one. George Steinbrenner.
Really? Well, he was the messiah for the Yankees pretty much. He's turned them around.
Well, that's not why. George was one of the most charitable people I've ever met to both cops and everybody else. I'll tell you a quick story. Mm-hmm. Rudy and I went to Sammy Sosa's hometown in the Dominican Republic. And while we were there, they showed us an orphanage that had been destroyed by, I forget the name of the hurricane, but whatever hurricane went through. And they said it would be $250,000 to rebuild it. 2 days later, I'm at a restaurant having breakfast with George Steinbrenner, and I mentioned it to him. That afternoon, a $250,000 check was on my desk for the Dominican Republic. I called him up and I said, let's get some publicity on this. He said, if you do, the check's no good. He says, just make sure those kids are taken care of. That's
Hurricane George.
That's why he's one of my favorite Yankees.
Yeah, that's a great story about him. I never knew that. Hurricane George is the name of the storm we were referencing. I just looked it up. And FEMA did a great job down there, too. A lot of the NYPD, FDNY guys went down there. I've heard some great stories out of that, of them helping out. Second, besides like promotion ceremonies or giving cops and firemen medals, which is great, obviously, happiest day as fire or police commissioner?
I was very happy the day that the first person we saved from cardiac arrest came and had lunch with me to tell me how important it was. That was my happiest day as fire commissioner.
It's a great thing.
And police commissioner, you know, there were lots and lots of happy days, but fun days is we used to have a stickball game against the fire department every year. And I hit a 3 sewer and we won.
I would say that's pretty fun. Third, best advice anyone ever
Tom
gave
was
you.
the fire commissioner.
Tom, yeah, he was. There's actually a picture. Let me see if I could find it while you answer the third question. Third, best advice anyone ever gave you. I'll find the picture and then I'll try to put it up. What's the best advice anyone ever gave you?
Best advice that anybody ever gave me was to don't listen to people who are criticizing you if you know you're right. Do what you need to do. And the other, which I use often, is just an old saying that, you know, if you're not the lead dog, the view's always the same.
That makes sense. And fourth, favorite bar or restaurant in New York City?
Probably still is, because I still go there, Nicola's. Nicola's is a great Italian restaurant on 84th Street. Tremendous food, great atmosphere. It's a real local family place.
I'll have to go and check it out if I can. And here's the picture before I get to the final question of the rapid fire. I'm going to display it right now. One moment. It's you playing stickball, as you said. I don't know if this is the swing you're referencing, but here it is. That might be it.
Could be.
Could very well be. There's Tom in the background staring on. A little good moment there between you two. And the fifth and final question, the rapid fire. Knowing what you know now, if you can go back in time and give advice to a younger version of yourself, what would you tell a young Howard Safir?
Be more transparent to the press. One of the things that I regret is we kind of had a bunker mentality in the Rudy administration. And if I could go back, I would be much more transparent. I think it works better for both the department and the public.
I think so too. Well said. Interesting perspective from you there. Stick around. We'll say goodbye off the air. Before I say goodbye to the audience, any shout outs you want to give to anyone or anything?
No, I just want to say I can't tell you what a privilege it was to be both fire and police commissioner. I had a great career in the federal government, but the NYPD and the FDNY were really special.
I concur. Like I said, stick around. We'll say goodbye off the air. Thanks to everyone who tuned in tonight. I see a lot of you, and if I didn't get to your questions, I apologize. But between YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter, once again, always appreciated. Coming up next on the Mike to New Haven podcast, he was a detective in the NYPD's narcotics division, as well as special victims. Before that, he was a correctional officer. John Basil will be here on Friday, so that should be an interesting show with him. 16 years in the NYPD, 4 in corrections. And then he was a deputy out in Florida in one of their sheriff's departments. So full plate for him. Interesting guy. And that should be an interesting show. In the meantime, on behalf of retired NYPD and FDNY Commissioner at that, Howard Safir, I'm Mike Colón, and we will see you next time. I'll see you Friday. Have a great night, everybody.